Hey, how's it going, Shayna? How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
Doing great. Obviously, coming up on Wednesday, NXT on USA Network, WWE Women's Tag Team Title match, you and Nia Jax against Dakota Kai and Raquel Gonzalez. It's going to be great. First and foremost, what can fans expect from this match from you guys coming up on Wednesday for the tag team titles?
Well, I think first and top of the list is it's going to be a very physical match. I think all four of us in this match are very physical wrestlers. You're not going to see anyone baby anyone. Obviously, Nia and I are not in the business of babying anyone. So I think it's going to be, one of the most physical women's matches people have seen in a long time.
When you and Nia came back to NXT 2 weeks ago, Dakota obviously mentioned the history you guys have from, at this point, 3 years ago, which is wild to think that it's been that long since you guys first faced off in NXT, that it's a different Dakota Kai coming into this matchup. Is it safe to say that she'll be facing a newer, more experienced, more dangerous Shayna Baszler as well?
Absolutely. I mean, everyone's trying to talk about how much Dakota has changed and how she's ready to stand up to me that used to bully her, but people are forgetting that I've had a road of my own. And if people think that there's not a difference between like NXT and Raw, for example, just look at how long it took me to get my footing. You know, I came in all hot-headed like I ruled NXT, and it's only been recently that I started getting my wheels turning and going somewhere. Yeah. So the fact that I am now doing that shows that I've grown too. So I think people are missing that point.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'm really glad you brought that up because I know you went into great detail about that on Renee Young's podcast recently, which was a really, really good listen. And you mentioned how only recently you've kind of found your footing on the main roster on Raw and whatnot. Do you feel like now, as of March 2021, this is the Shayna Baszler of the main roster, or do you still think you're still in that process of trying to find your footing even almost a year later?
I think if you ever are satisfied with where you're at, that's a bad spot to be. So I think anyone, that's any good wrestler is going to tell you they're not there yet. They're still getting there, even if they're a champion, which I am. And so I think, even though yes, I am more comfortable, and now I'm actually gaining traction and getting ground, I'm still headed somewhere. It's not the full form of me yet, and I think that's going to be true. As long as I'm in this business, hopefully, I think when that doesn't happen is when I know that I should be done,
And having been on the main roster now for just a little over a year, you were in NXT for 2.5 years, from late 2017 up until early 2020. Upon being moved to Raw, right on the road to WrestleMania, which is probably prime time to be moved up to the main roster, what did you notice were like the biggest differences between being in NXT for such a long time and then immediately being called up to Monday Night Raw?
Well, I think obviously the audience being bigger on Raw, it's what's the word? Maybe like it's a little less intimate than an NXT. So the way I have to broadcast my message definitely had to change. It doesn't translate as well in a less intimate setting, and that's not good or bad. That's just the difference. Yeah. And Raw's been around forever, so it's going to be a lot bigger. So I think that was the biggest thing was, rather than beating my head against a wall and insisting that this worked at NXT so it should here, it was realizing I need to also change for the different audience that is on Raw.
Was it cool kind of being able to do the Raw Underground stuff too? Because that was also, I mean, I know it wasn't around for very long, but we also kind of got to see the Shayna Baszler of NXT, you yourself, and we've been able to see that on Raw since then as well, but that was really able to highlight your skill set as well. Was that kind of a fun experiment for you for as long as that lasted for?
Yeah, I loved that. And I know that, I don't know how fans thought about it, but that's like the most comfortable I've felt. Not just, obviously you can bring up like my MMA background and how I climbed my way from, I was doing shows that looked almost exactly like Underground in MMA that were just in a warehouse and people standing around and sign up at the door type stuff.
Yeah.
So that was very familiar to me. On top of that, though, even coming up in pro wrestling, obviously being trained by like Josh Barnett and Billy Robinson, that UWFI style is very Raw Underground. So I think that's I honestly, I talk about getting my footing and feeling comfortable as myself. I think that Raw Underground happening had a hand in that. It helped me to I get in a Raw Underground ring and I'm feeling comfortable and I know exactly what to do and it was more intimate, like we were talking about.
Yeah.
So I think that had a hand in making me feel comfortable with myself moving up to Raw.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the biggest differences, too, or one of the biggest similarities between Raw Underground, where you were pre-WWE, and NXT, is that they're all kind of very intimate settings. And being back in NXT must have been like a cool experience. And I mean, obviously this Wednesday, but when you first returned as a surprise appearance with Nia 2 weeks ago, was that like a cool experience for you to be back there after almost a year away?
Yeah, it was, I'd be lying if I didn't say it was awesome to hear a crowd chanting my name. My whole time at NXT, people hated me.
Yeah.
So it was kind of, and that's whatever, you take it in stride. I don't care. I held the title. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But anyone's lying if they say that it doesn't feel good to have a crowd chanting your name and to know that the work I did at NXT was remembered and that I made my stamp down there. And then on top of the fact that they have a small, even though it's, 50 people or whatever, it's a small live crowd. We really take for granted. I mean, the Thunderdome is awesome, and it's definitely better than when we were in an empty performance center. But there's something, wrestling is meant to be experienced live, and I think that that goes both ways. So whether you're watching or whether you are the one in the ring, it's meant to be live, and I think that it was just a breath of fresh air to feel that again.
Yeah, no, at the Capitol Wrestling Center. And I'm glad you brought that up, too, because in NXT, it seems like even, like, the bad guys and yourself when you were in NXT, I guess with the exception of yourself, every bad guy is, like, beloved by the audience in NXT. It's a very different dynamic than on the main roster, but I think you were able to achieve something when you were the NXT Women's Champion, where people, like, genuinely didn't like you, but they, like, loved to hate you, if that made sense. You know what I mean? Like, you were able to capture that when you were the NXT Women's Champion for as long as you were. And now those same people that were booing you when you were the NXT Women's Champion are the ones that are cheering you on the main roster. So it's kind of a cool, weird dynamic to see. But being on Raw for the last year, and now you're one half of the Women's Tag Team Champions, is there anyone that you've been able to get closer to on the main roster? Because obviously Jessamine and Marina, they're still in NXT, but I mean, I guess everything's being filmed out of Florida right now. Is there anyone that you've gotten closer to behind the scenes, aside from Nia in your last year?
I mean, obviously, I don't know how you want to define closer. You already spoke about Nia, like we hated each other and then we kind of made a business deal. And now I don't want to say, we're not like texting each other every day and we're not hanging out, but she's someone that maybe I'll park my gear bag next to in the locker room. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? But obviously being here, and even when I first came here, being on the road for the short time I was when we were traveling, you're going to get to know people more. Mm-hmm. So I think understanding why people act a certain way or why they wrestle a certain way, I think that has happened. Yeah. I'm not necessarily like, nobody here's my best friend, but I think like I came here to carry a legacy of old school catch wrestling, not necessarily to make a bunch of friends. But yeah. I mean, I definitely appreciate the girls here more than I did when I first came. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think it's something like that, I guess, just takes time. And I mean, you talked about finding your footing as well. How long did it kind of take you to find your footing as a tag team wrestler, having been in the singles competition ranks, at least in NXT? I mean, obviously you would team on occasion with Jessamine and Marina, but other than that, I mean, you were really largely a singles star in NXT. How long did it take for that adjustment period to kind of, or are you still in it even to this day as a tag team person?
Man, honestly, tag team wrestling is so deep and wide that I've only barely scratched the surface. And the dynamic me and Nia have, both of us really are singles wrestlers, really. Mm-hmm. But I think the dynamic we have works. We're not one of those tag teams that's like tagging in, doing these double team crazy awesome moves, but we definitely work well together. Mm-hmm. And I think where at the beginning of our team up, you saw two singles wrestlers tagging in and doing something on their own. Now you do see us kind of working together. Now you do see us helping out, helping each other out, making saves maybe that are well timed and needed. So I think, like, if you want to talk about tag team wrestling and these great tag teams that you think of when you think of that, I don't think we're even close to that.
Yeah.
But also that's our dynamic.
Yeah.
So to say that we're not one of the best tag teams that have come around is also wrong. You know what I mean? I think it's just how do I even want to answer it? It's like we've figured out how to be a tag team.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's worked for us. So we've figured out how to be two singles wrestlers that work really well together on a team.
Yeah, no, it makes sense too. And it's not like it hasn't worked because you guys have been champions on and off since August. So it's not like, you put it together and you were only champion for a brief period. It's obviously worked as well as it can, and you guys are still tag team champions right now. That being said, when you first arrive to Monday Night Raw, you're literally immediately thrust into the spotlight in the feud with Becky Lynch. You were in the Women's Rumble. You main evented a pay-per-view at Elimination Chamber. I think people forget about that. Had the quickest chamber performance of all time, eliminating every woman in the matchup. Again, I think people just kind of forget about that a year later, and that was the final event with fans, crazily enough. What was that like? I mean, just knowing that, being brought up to Raw, that one of your first things that you have to do is main eventing a pay-per-view, winning it, and then going on to WrestleMania to face one of the biggest female stars that WWE's had in recent years.
It's crazy, and it's going to sound like I'm tooting my own horn, but like, to be thrust into the deep end of the pool immediately upon arrival is a big ask for anyone. And to be fair, some people get in there off the high dive and do all kinds of stuff and show up, and I think I definitely showed up. But I also think there was some learning, and I had to tread water for a little bit. So I think that there's a lot of factors that could go into that. Obviously, being thrust into this main title picture immediately, being asked to perform, and we talked about, like, the difference in how I had to perform, and just learning that on the fly while all eyes are on me. That's a thing that I think people don't realize, is that it's like, when just because you signed to WWE or you're champion at NXT and you move to Raw, it doesn't mean that you're it immediately. Yeah. My learning just happened to be done at the most visible time in my career. So I don't know that I did any, I didn't do any worse or better than anyone. I think people just saw a different stage in where I was at. And so, where some people come up and they're not necessarily in the main title picture, but they're here, and it takes them a year or two before they start gaining ground, and then they really start turning heads. Yeah. That part where they weren't necessarily in the main title picture, I was, so you got to see all my learning process. Exactly. And I think, like, I don't know, fans maybe don't think about that sometimes, that here I was, this big-headed former NXT champion ready to come in, but man, I had a lot to learn. Yeah. No, like you said, it's such a huge ask, because you're not just being moved to Raw or SmackDown is just a big ask just in general, because it's a different stage in NXT. And then being brought up, pay-per-view main event, Becky Lynch at WrestleMania, it's a huge ask. And then on top of that, like, it's funny, we go back almost exactly a year ago, right before the Elimination Chamber pay-per-view. You see these rumblings, oh, Vince isn't high on Shayna, blah, blah, blah. And then you go on to win the Elimination Chamber main event. So, like, when you... I guess, I don't know if you read or hear this stuff or hear the rumblings or whatever. Does that bother you at all? Or is it like, listen, I can't listen to that stuff because I have my own pressure to kind of deal with going into the biggest event of the year right now? It's funny you ask that, because so in my time in the UFC and being friends with Ronda, and I think everybody's familiar with the kind of fallout and backlash just from Ronda being who she was. Yeah. And being associated with Ronda, I think I've dealt with all the being affected, and I don't want to say it doesn't affect me, but I really don't. It doesn't bother me near as much as it would have if I hadn't experienced that already. I think a side of it too is that because of the nature of the sport that we're in right now, this professional wrestling, I talked to you earlier about, like, I know the reason why certain girls do the things they do and stuff. I think there's a big part of the business that we as wrestlers hold sacred. And I think that helps a lot, because even if a dirt sheet writes it or fans are tweeting it, there is a side of us that's like, well, they don't know. We know the secrets.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And even no matter how inside someone thinks they are, you're not inside unless you're in this locker room with us.
Yeah.
So that helps a lot too, where, you know, you're scrolling or whatever you're doing. You're on the toilet and you're on your phone or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's the time I'm always on my phone. But like, you see it scroll by. But like I said, to hear, you know, it's like, okay, I'll read this thing. I don't know. For example, you know, Vince is not high on Shayna right now. I read this. But also, I can know that fans don't know, like, oh, he actually talked to me yesterday and it was not any of this.
Exactly,
okay, cool.
Yeah.
So it's good to have that kind of like sacred part of the business that's ours only.
Yeah.
And it really helps deal with kind of that negativity and stuff.
Yeah, no, for sure. Final few questions for you, Shannon. You mentioned the relationship with Ronda, obviously, how far you guys go back. There's been talk for years, ever since, because you were the first one that arrived in WWE of all the Four Horsewomen of the UFC. There's been talk ever since then of a Four Horsewoman match. Do you think is that still something you want to see happen at some point, or do you think that time has kind of come and gone?
Well, I think that could be intriguing at any moment. You know what I mean? The other girls, Charlotte, Becky, Sasha, Bayley, they're still top of their game right now. So I don't think I think any time could be a time to ignite that. Now, I've always said they're four great wrestlers. They're four of the best wrestlers that have ever been. Nobody's ever argued that. The four of us, Rhonda and Jess and Marina and myself, we've never denied that. We've never not proclaimed that they're four of the best. But we're a team. We're an actual team. You can't just pick 11 random good football players and call them the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That's a specific team.
Yeah.
Like, that's what we've always argued. So, you know, if fans want to see us show like what being a team and what being like four random really good wrestlers is, then we'd always be down to do that. We never turn down fights. So.
Yeah. Hopefully at some point we get to see it. And final question for you, Shayna. I would be remiss if I didn't ask this. My girlfriend's a big fan of yours, and she loves the theme song. She's a big tattoo person, and the one question that she wanted me to ask you, what is the genesis? I mean, obviously the Queen of Spades, but what was like the catalyst behind the cards tattoo that you have on your shoulder? Because it's really cool.
Well, I got the Queen of Spades name from the fact that I do card magic sometimes. I'm not like amazing or anything. It's just like if I have a deck of cards on me, I can do some cool stuff.
Yeah, it was on the Chronicle.
Yeah, and so it just made sense. I wanted to do so when I talked to the tattoo artist that did that work. I wanted to do like a royal flush, but I wanted to make the Queen of Spades card obviously the most prominent card in that. So he drew up this thing where it was basically the cards are in like a pyramid type of stack. Yeah. And the Queen of Spades one was in front, and I loved it, and that was how it happened. So.
And it's a cool tattoo, and that's awesome. So people can check you out on Wednesday this upcoming week. You and Nia Jax versus Dakota Kai, Raquel Gonzalez, WWE Women's Tag Team titles on USA Network. It's going to be an awesome match. Shayna, thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it, and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. You too.